Welcome to the Under the Hat podcast, the show where we talk about everything and anything that is top of mind in education. The goal is to provide meaningful conversation to what is currently happening in our classrooms. Stories, pains, moments of success. We want to hear it all. Welcome, friends. We're here making Under the Hat history because this is the first time, even though it's really early on, this is the first time that I've done a double header. Is that the correct term? Like two shows in one day. And it was kind of just one of those things where it's like stars aligned. I had two people that were willing and were keen to be on the show today. This morning, if you're around, you saw Manny. Super great mind, super great leader in education, super kind too. Like I just laugh and around Manny, and I'm super appreciative of him being on the show. But tonight we're also joined by my good friend Tim Belmont. And so Tim, we've met like remotely digitally before. It's so great to connect with you not in person, but face to face like this. And so I just appreciate you being here. But let's get the conversation going. Tim, how are you this evening?
I'm doing pretty good, Steve, and I'm psyched to be here. Psyched that we are synchronously meeting tonight and chatting. Yeah, we've been connected for a little bit, but it's nice that we've been able to interact a little bit more recently. And yeah, I'm doing pretty good. Just heading towards spring break next week, so wrapping up things at school, and yeah, doing pretty good.
Yeah, awesome. I just love your bio and what you include in it. And you give that context, right? Like, so high school technology specialist, language arts teacher, based in Rutherford, New Jersey. And I'm not trying to gloss over the other piece because it's super good, like FETC, ISTE. But then at the very end, folks, it's really important that in his free time, he does enjoy developing collaborative online tools and baking homemade bread. And
Yes,
I just love that you can include, like, you know what, this is that piece of me. Like, that's the piece of me that you should also be aware of.
Yeah.
So really quick, because I don't want,
Mhm.
I want to go into actual content. So first of all, how'd you get into the bread scene?
So I did a stint where I was living by myself in an apartment in Jersey City. It's probably around 2016, 2017. And I always have really liked the taste of sourdough bread. And I was like, you know what? I've got time. I have a kitchen and it's just for me. So I decided I would start to make a sourdough starter and start baking bread. And after a couple failed attempts, I ended up making a couple loaves that I was happy with. And it's sort of something that I come back to when I need to disconnect from looking at a screen, using technology, do something with my hands. And making bread, it requires patience. It takes a while and you have to wait for it to be ready. And then, once it's done, you eat it. And then it's not like taking up painting where your house is full of paintings. You just get to make more. So it's something that really has been a good little escape for me. And I can always, as I mentioned, step away and do that at any time.
Yeah, no, that's super important. We will move on from this. Don't worry. But I'm just saying, like, if
Sure.
I'm ever in New Jersey, I'm be like, Tim, where's that bread at?
Give me a heads up and I will have a loaf ready for you. If you have any preferences, any toppings like sesame seeds, or we want some whole wheat in there, we can make it happen.
Whew, dang. All right, cool. Say less. So Tim, like you've done a lot in education, I feel, and like kind of looking at like the places you've been, different conferences, like you mentioned FETC in your bio, MassQ, right? And Tim, we were able to connect recently, like over a virtual conference. And so kind of like everybody has like a niche, like these people like yourselves that are putting themselves out there, sharing their levels of expertise, their experiences with students. And what you've done is something that like similar to like what I was doing in the classroom was really like amplifying that student voice with student podcasting and the media literacy. And my understanding is that you were teaching ELA, you're teaching English in this context. So maybe a little bit of like, sharing, people that don't know you, right, or have not seen your work, like how'd you get there? Like what was that journey like getting into that kind of work in the classroom?
Sure. So I started working in my current high school in Lyndhurst, which is very close to where I live in Rutherford. This is my 12th year teaching there. And I was hired as an ELA teacher. And from the start, I mostly taught freshman English, and I also taught public speaking. In the school that I teach in, public speaking is a graduation requirement. So it's an elective that every student has to take. And so I was teaching that for most of the years that I have been at LHS. And I was always interested in podcasting, listening to them. I dabbled with implementing it into my English class a little bit, but I got an opportunity to create an elective, which was advanced public speaking. My supervisor thought if someone's really interested in speaking, then they should have the opportunity to bring those skills forward. So I was able to make this curriculum for advanced public speaking from scratch. And I was basically told, what do you think the next logical step is with teaching public speaking? And it started off as implementing technology into presentations. So maybe doing a presentation and bringing in a slide deck and interacting with that, or even having some interactive games and things. But over time, I decided I wanted to also add podcasting to it. So slowly, every year I did it, I would experiment with students recording a podcast, recording short clips and things like that. And I eventually found out about the NPR Student Podcast Challenge, which NPR, they run this contest every year where students can record a podcast and submit it, and then the winner gets played on NPR. And once I discovered that, that sort of became a framework for, in my advanced public speaking class, recording podcasts. And so over time, I've been doing this elective for 4 or 5 years now. And so now the curriculum is basically half podcasting and half presenting in front of the class. And
Mhm.
over time, I've implemented more into that. Like, I'm sure we're going to talk about adding in media literacy as a big part of that as well. So not just recording podcasts, but analyzing them also. And as far as with me presenting, I basically just started submitting proposals to conferences because I had gone through this process of learning how to implement it just over time. And I had learned so much about what worked, what didn't work, and I wanted to share that with people. So that's sort of been, I, I almost hesitate to call it my area of expertise because I feel like every time I do it, every school year, I'm learning more and more about how to effectively do student podcasting. And also, during the pandemic, I also received the title of technology specialist in my district, in my school, rather. And so I also now run professional development for teachers in my school with platforms that we've purchased or things that are emerging. And so I've shared podcasting and other things with other teachers. So sharing with other educators has become a huge passion of mine as well. And I enjoy doing it. Um, Not only does it help me share what I've learned, but it reinforces the things I've learned also. So I'm still sort of on my journey, figuring out the best way to podcast and then to, share knowledge with others. But that's sort of where how I got to where I am now.
Yeah, I think that podcasting in general it's always ongoing because the platforms change, like like the actual technology of it, like that changes.
Mm-hmm.
But then B, like what how you may facilitate it from like a content objective may also change, right?
Yeah.
And so Tim, I had no idea that you did it in the context of like speech, of like public speaking, right? Like, and
Mm-hmm.
to me, what comes to mind is like the student, and I was low key that student, like in college, where like, oh, I have to take public speaking, and 18-year-old Steve was actually very nervous to talk in front of people. Now it's what I do for a living, right?
Sure,
Like
yeah.
which is when I think back on it, like that is strange. And there was a lot of like growing and, you know, you know, growing up that led me to this area of my life. But I would imagine like if I would have had a teacher in college that was like, look, we're going to use the power of podcasting to ease that anxiety,
Hmm.
that would have been a way different experience for me. So I don't know if that was kind of like where you went into it or if that was top of mind at all. But I can see how that would be useful for a group of learners who do that has that anxiety and fear of speaking in front of people.
Right. That is definitely a part of it. And there's something that I recommend my public speaking students to do, which in the sort of level 1 public speaking class, we don't record full podcasts, mainly logistically because every class has 30 students, which is just logistically figuring out how to do that is tough. But what I do have them do is I have them record videos of themselves and they submit videos of them talking and reflecting.
Mm.
And that different context of speaking, it allows for people to get more comfortable with themselves when they're talking, recording themselves speaking, listening back to it. And that can sometimes transfer to just being more comfortable with your voice in general to do it in front of the class. So it's not like it's not like it's replacing that skill of standing up in front of people, but it can sort of be a stepping stone. But then even just in a modern context, most public speaking that people are doing, they're doing it digitally anyway. So it's has that authenticity as well.
Right. No, that's great. That makes I love how you put it. You put it better than I like it's a stepping stone, right?
Hmm.
It's not like you're replacing it like, oh, we're just making a bunch of videos now. They're being
Yeah.
stored somewhere up in the cloud, right? Like you're and I can probably see that collaboratively. I can see how students are seeing like, ooh, this is what this person's doing.
Hmm.
I can see maybe like examples, non-examples, like you do that in a very appropriate and you know, no one's being rude. You know,
Right.
that's the goal, right?
Yeah, I mean,
um,
that's a big thing with, public speaking in general is you have to have that supportive community. And this is it's a slight tangent, but it's important and it's something I stress to my students a lot is in a public speaking class, a lot of times students come in and they're like, okay, my job is to speak. But the fact is they have two jobs. It's speaking and then being an audience member and being supportive, which arguably is more important. So again, yeah, having that support is huge.
yeah, yeah. So you kind of mentioned that like, it's not always full on podcasting, right?
Hmm.
But they get to the point where, and maybe like your level 2 class is kind of what I'm hearing, like
Yeah.
we start getting into that. So I'm just curious, and I'm selfishly I'm going to be like taking notes here because I'm curious because I am still doing podcasting at a certain level with my adult learners.
Hmm.
Um, so I was really big into the storyboarding, like the planning.
Hmm.
How how did you or how are you facilitating that? Like like rule number one of podcasting in my head is like just don't just turn on a mic and start recording, even though that's what I do with the show. But when we're doing it with students,
Sure. Yeah,
I
absolutely.
guess I guess the best practice is to get them to put the prep, to do the outline, to do the
Hmm.
storyboard. And it's really in my head, it was always like, okay, well, they're building an essay just in a different medium, right? And
Right.
so I'm just curious like how you went about that, maybe some tips for teachers, people listening that are wanting to dive into this work.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I'm glad that you mentioned that planning step because when someone sees the process of recording a podcast, there are the certain aspects of it that are very sort of flashy and novel, and it draws people in, like sitting in front of a microphone and talking, and making the artwork to post online and things like that. Which all of that's important, but I really do stress the idea of making a plan before you sit down and record. And I have a couple of different planning documents that I share with students depending on the format that they have. So if they're doing a more sort of scripted show, almost like a, like an NPR investigative type thing,
Yeah.
then that really does have a similar sort of essay format where you think about your opening, you think about your segments, sort of like body paragraphs, and then you have your closing. But then what I have is it's a chart and it has the speech and then also things like sound effects and music cues and things like that. So it brings in that multimedia element. So they're not writing a full essay, but it still has that structure, as you mentioned. And then even if they're doing an interview, I tell them, if you watch a podcast where two people are talking, typically it's not like they just show up and they just chat. There are questions and topics and all of those things. And so you have to have that plan also. So typically we go through that whole process together. The idea of planning the podcast, recording it, editing it, and then publishing it. And even with a speech, you have to do the planning. And I sort of approach it like a speech sometimes. So it has that similar sort of structure.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think I did the former only exclusively. Maybe like I didn't think about when I was in the classroom doing the interview approach,
Mm-hmm.
um, for no real reason other than it did. I just didn't lean into that is what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
And but yeah, like I did have a similar template as you that had it's almost like a slide deck where yeah they were documenting some of the loose script. They
Yeah.
could have kept it as tight or as open as they wanted,
Mm-hmm.
but they also had like I had another area of each slide of like, well, what do we want to see for transition? What do we want to hear for transition?
Right.
Like is there an intro jingle, right? Like how is it a silly show? Is it not a silly show, right?
Yeah. Setting that tone. Yeah.
Setting that tone, closing remarks, stuff like that. And so yeah, so I'm glad that I was somewhat on the mark with all that.
Yeah. No,
And
it's such a big part. Yeah.
yeah, uh, and so yeah, so you have the planning, you have I can see how naturally it is aligned to standards, right? Like depending on what you're teaching, that part of it is good. What about the editing part of it? Like how, and maybe this is getting into the media literacy of it,
Mm-hmm.
but how, especially if work like this is being done in a class that's not a media literacy class,
Yeah.
that's not a technology class in the traditional sense, like because I used
Mm-hmm.
to hear that from my colleagues all the time, be like, Steve, you don't teach technology, you teach history. I'm like, yeah, but we're taking a different path with it. I felt like I was teaching them skills that are actually a little bit more relevant, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so how much energy, how much scaffolding was involved? Like, what did that look like in terms of the media literacy and the editing, all that?
Mm-hmm.
What feels like additional stuff that gets added?
Yeah, I think that's a great question as well, and I'm very, very lucky that I was able to construct the curriculum for this class because
Mm.
the main goal of it are those speaking standards, as you mentioned. But I got to sort of add in sort of auxiliary skills related to podcasting that students could work on. And that includes that idea of media literacy, those technology skills, which, as you mentioned, they're all relevant to the field of podcasting and to just they're relevant skills in general. So I always try to keep those standards in as the main focus for when they are doing their podcast. Like it's almost like everything that we're doing, thinking about the the purpose of your podcast and the editing, it's all to serve the speaking in a sense. So it all sort of leads to that. But I do want to mention with the media literacy, I address that a lot before we even start planning the podcast because I used to before I was teaching public speaking in my English class, I would teach a lot of things about digital citizenship and media literacy and misinformation and bias and things like that. And So what I started doing last year, and this is my second year doing it, is we do a whole lesson about bias and about things that are subjective or objective, and what the purpose of a podcast is, and the fact that students should be very clear with what the purpose of their podcast is, because they don't want to uh, misinform the audience unintentionally, like present this as, oh, this is objective information, when mostly it's my opinion on something. So we actually analyzed some podcasts. We listened to some clips from the top 10 podcasts on Spotify, and we discussed, do you think this is objective? Is it subjective? How subjective is it? What do you think the reason the person made this podcast is? And it's helpful to get that sort of context for why people create podcasts. And it helps them decide, why do I want to make my podcast? Do I want to just give knowledge to the audience, or do I want to influence what they think with my opinions? And sort of how you do that. So that's something that I've sort of added more and more to. And we think about it as we record, but we also do it before we even start planning also. And then to mention the editing aspect of it, that's something where some students absolutely love editing, some students absolutely hate it. And I think people are like that. And I
Yep.
think that some people love that part of it and some people hate it. But again, maybe if someone isn't really too appealed to the speaking part of it, they can latch on to that technological part, the engineering aspect of it a little bit, and find that as their entry point to creating it.
Jigsaw that process.
Mm-hmm.
Like that was kind of, maybe jigsaw is not the right like technical teacher term, but like every student has a role, right?
Yeah, totally.
It is jigsawed in the sense like, oh, every student has a specialization. Because
Mm-hmm.
I used to do that where like, okay, I'm having, we have a team lead, I have a producer, right?
Right. Yeah,
And
totally.
then you have more like, oh, I've like kind of what you talking about with the engineer. Like I have somebody that's working on just the editing side,
Mm-hmm.
the actual voice actor, right? And I found that works out pretty well because you're going to get a group of like 3 or 4 students that can do that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's been awesome, because what I do is, as the class goes on, students do a survey and they sort of say which role they like the most. And then it's like, all right, you're going to make a show, and it's the 3 of you, and they can each sort of take the reins for that role that they like, which I still, because again, the standards are speaking, they all have to speak at least a little bit on this show. But, one person, if they really want to be the host, they'll be on there more.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. I just love, Tim, like your take on how all, like, it just feels like all of this is like in the whole mix of things, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
like it sounds like you're integrating this well. And like my friend Samantha kind of hit it on the head, I feel, of just like skills should not be taught in isolation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so in a public speaking class, we're not just like, oh, here's this one little thing of the
Yeah.
standards or that one skill, and that's all we're going to be teaching for a week and then move on. Like for you, like all of this stuff is relevant, right? And especially from like a literacy standpoint, podcasting hits a lot of different areas.
Yeah, totally.
And my friend, while we're here and while I'm up here in the chat, my friend Sophie has an interesting question of like, have you ever done the worst podcast where they do all the things you're not supposed to do? Almost like, let's all try to do the non-example,
Mm-hmm.
just to point all that out. Is that something you've ever done?
So I love that idea. In my public speaking class, I have students make slideshows they break every possible rule. But I've never done that with a podcast. But the closest thing I've done is I've recorded a podcast myself that has a ton of errors, and they have to edit it and fix it. But I'm proud. Thank you, Sophie. I'm probably gonna use this. It's awesome.
My good friend Sophie, that's why she's in my life, is just there for all the good ideas, because I don't think I have any. But But I do love where this conversation is headed in the sense of like, that student podcasting hitting different modalities,
Mm-hmm.
hitting um not to get totally derailed here. Please share that out.
I will, with permission. I will.
With permission, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so yeah, it's just like, it just, again, it's just the the and again, this is another proof. I'm a planner. Steve is not. Yes, as I'm trying to plan my next thought, Sophie's keeping me from doing so. Anyway, yeah. So like, so let's talk a little bit more in terms of. I know that one thing I did quite often was having that intended audience,
Mm-hmm.
and I know that you kind of spoke on that on a more global level, like entering contests, stuff of that nature. Um, would you ever, you know, have an intended audience that maybe was at the school level, district level? Was there any, like, was that something you navigated at all with your students?
Yeah, this is something that I'm still. It's an area that I want to improve in the class itself, is having audiences that, as you mentioned, are a bit more intentional and focused. Because right now, the way it works is we essentially, I stress from the very beginning that these podcasts, they're meant to be shared. They're not supposed to exist in isolation just for me to listen to. And the goal
Mm,
sort of is we try to expand that audience as the class goes on and everybody gets more comfortable. So what we do right now is the first podcast, which the students have to have their podcast done by the end of this week. They're going to be shared on a Google site that is
mm,
accessible to the class and then anybody who, like, close friends they choose to share it with. And then the next one, it's going to be on a Google site that is going to be, the link will be shared so that anybody in the school can access it. So, one great thing about using Google Sites for this is they have those privacy settings where you can limit it to a certain domain. So, you have to be logged into a school email address in order to see them. And then over time, we do get to the point where they have the option of putting their podcasts onto Spotify and sharing them publicly. And again, that also is a whole lesson about privacy and things like that. Like, they're urged not to share personal information and things like that. And
mm,
there
mhm,
was a whole process with the school as far as the best practices as well. But for me, the thing that I want to improve upon, and this is something that I presented at IdeaCon a couple weeks ago in Chicago, which was an excellent experience. That conference was a great time, and I presented on podcasting, and I was talking to some other teachers, and they were like, "If you want, I could have my students listen to your students' podcasts." So going from the school to the world, having an intermediary where they're sharing with other students and getting feedback from them. That's sort of what I'm trying to build in at this point.
yeah, I was certainly doing work like that, not with podcasting necessarily, but with the project-based learning experience. Uh, and yeah, Samantha's right that it's like it's real life, right? Like,
Mhm.
it's cool real life collaboration, that we didn't get like 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
like we live we lived in our own four walls of
Uh-huh.
our classrooms. Um, so it kind of strikes something right now in my brain, because my former school, uh, I won't share out his name. Let's call him James. Uh, he teaches. He basically has his own little pathway. They have at my former school a journalism uh, program,
Mhm.
which is, he teaches like 2 or 3 classes on it. And before, he had the brilliant idea. I'm like, wait, for years this program had like, oh, they're just creating newspapers, and they're what's what's the news at the school, right? Like,
Right, yeah.
different, like prom, or sometimes they be like stories that are kind of more deep and more real, like things that's how are students feeling when students return from the pandemic, how are they coping? How are they doing? It's a pretty cool program.
Mhm.
And then he had the brilliant idea, like, wait a second, why aren't we doing podcasts? So his intended audience was the school itself. Like, he was able to put it on air somehow. I don't know the logistics. I can find out. But like, it's that idea of like, cool, like the intended audience doesn't have to be this massive thing. And it
Mhm.
can be authentic if it's in the context of like, you're just trying to deliver the news, you're trying to deliver like content to your school site. And he got the, I don't know, however much money it costs to do like 3 little soundboards,
Mhm.
3 mics, kind of like, not too heavy lifting on like the actual hardware of it. And then he just ran with it. So I guess like my question with all that, Tim, is like, so what did you have to do from like a hardware standpoint, like in terms of the actual tangible things you needed in your classroom, and like maybe some tips on cost, maybe like ways around that, as if, if any teachers are listening wanting to get into podcasting.
Yeah, totally. So when I first started, I all I had was a recording interface that I just had at home, and I ended
Yeah.
up just bringing it to school. It's a Focusrite Scarlett, which is a little USB box that you can hook up a microphone to. And then to get it started, I did end up spending a little bit of my own money. I just bought some used equipment from this company, Reverb.
Hmm.
Um, so I got these little interfaces you can plug in, and they work with Chromebooks. And then after I sort of showed my school, like, I can do this, this works, they ended up allocating me a little bit of money, and we ended up getting the microphone I'm using right now is a Rode Pod mic. So we have 2 of these, and then we have these interfaces that we use, which ended up, they were like $50 each. So I have like a little mobile studio that we can bring around. We end up recording mostly in our school media center because we have breakout rooms so students can go in there and record. But the advice that I say to most teachers who are interested in podcasting is the equipment really shouldn't be a hurdle, because the fact is, if you can go through that process of planning, and you can go through the process of having somewhere to publish them, like on a Google site. I mean, a lot of students have a phone, and the microphones on cell phones and devices are really, really good. And
Yeah.
there are different platforms out there where you could just record using hardware you already have. So as far as navigating things like hardware and equipment, I think it's helpful to have a sort of proof of concept using whatever equipment you have available to you. And then you could sort of talk to, if you're looking for some funds from the school to do it. Um, because I know that that's what worked for me, is I sort of used what I had, and then I showed the higher ups, and they said, this is working out well. We're going to sort of add to your suite of tools that you have. Um, And you mentioned the idea of having like soundboards and things like that, which those are excellent. I don't really use stuff like that. I'd love to get my hands on it, but maybe at some point if the funds are available. But I do want to just shout out real quick another teacher who's Chris Nessie. He's a New Jersey-based teacher. He presented at NJECC when I was there, and I went to his session on student podcasting because one of the best things I can do as someone who does podcasting is to learn from others who do it and see what they're doing differently. And he does a live morning show podcast at his school every morning, and they have the full like live setup, and it was so impressive, and it was so cool to see the students really, really engage with that. And again, that's that authentic audience sending it out to that community every single day. So there are different levels of, going back to your original question, there are these different levels of hardware that you can have, but it really is about using what's on hand and then sort of going from there, because there are so many options.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that issue with the board.
Mm-hmm.
Um, So kind of a little bit about my journey of this show.
Please,
Um,
please.
so this show was like, it was having a podcast was something that was on my mind for, it was a good like year and a half.
Mhm.
And I expressed that to my wife. So like my wife had purchased, it was like one year for Christmas. It was like 3 books on like how to podcast, like almost like podcasting for dummies. Like I was like,
Okay.
okay, that's cool. That's great. But then she also bought me a board, like a full on board. And I used it. I used it for my general work, like presenting and delivering professional development and stuff. And after a while, I'm like, wait a second. If you have a good mic, you don't even need this thing. And I'm glad she bought it. Like I'm glad I was able to play with it. There's a lot of learning with it. But then I found like sometimes that the more tech you have, the more likely it is that something's gonna break
100%.
or something's not gonna go right.
Mhm.
And so yeah, I'm glad. Like for me, it was like if you have a mic in any mic and it's going somewhere, that's really all you need. And that's been my experience so far. But like certainly doing it with students, right? And for me, it was like I was doing the same thing as you. Like, they have they would just have their phones and record themselves.
Mhm.
So I guess the other layer to that, which we've kind of talked about sort of, but maybe you can give some recommendations, is like software, right? So more of like, okay, we have all the content, the students have curated, they've created, there's taking that creativity to the next level. So I did what was it, the Premiere Rush? I think
Yeah,
that
the
was one that I've
Adobe
used.
one.
The Adobe one. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Soundtrap is another one that I've used.
Mhm.
Before I left my district, they had paid for the subscription for We Video,
Right.
which to me, We Video was like, it was that happy medium of like, okay, you can do some serious stuff in here, but also like intuitive enough where like even I was able to go in and be like, oh, I get this, right? And not
Right.
an expert in that. Do you have different recommendations? The same, like how did
So
you navigate all that?
so my recommendations are similar, a lot of the similar platforms that you mentioned. So at Lyndhurst High School, we have a subscription to Soundtrap, and I love Soundtrap. But if anybody's used a digital audio workstation like Soundtrap, Audacity is another one that's free that a lot of people
Oh,
use,
mhm,
and there's another one, Reaper, that is also free. There is a learning curve because you have different layers, you have a lot of different things you can adjust, and so you have to have that built-in time to teach students how to use it, which, as I said, I have the luxury of doing that in my advanced public speaking class. So we get to practice in Soundtrap. The advantage of using a platform like Soundtrap, it is web-based, so it works on Chromebooks. And there's another platform that just came out. Eric Geis, who's another New Jersey educator who is big into tech and shares a lot of tools. I think it's called like Wavacity. It's a version of Audacity, but it's browser based too. Um,
mm,
One thing with that is I like that because if you have more than one microphone, you can have them on separate tracks and you can edit them individually. So students like that because it gives them more control when they're doing something like an interview.
mm,
However, I will say, with speaking to educators at the conferences I've been to lately, a lot of them use WeVideo for podcasting. And I think because of what you mentioned, it has that sort of user friendliness. It's intuitive, and then it also is a multi-tool because it can do audio really well, but it also does video and it does all of these different things. So, I mean, I have to give a recommendation of that, even not even based on my experience, just because of what other people have said. And then also, usually what I would recommend here is just Spotify for podcasters, which used to be known as Anchor. And that's the platform that Spotify has for essentially compiling or recording podcasts. And you can do it all in your browser and you can upload it right to Spotify. I will mention that in June, they are changing it and they're bringing in this other provider called Riverside, which I'm not too familiar with. So those are the ones that I would recommend, the ones that from what I've heard or what I've experienced.
Yeah. No, I appreciate all that. And again, it's like anything else with ed tech where it's like, here's this giant list
Yeah, totally. It's a lot.
It is a lot. I will say the thing about We Video, I did appreciate, like, and maybe I'm not using the right term, but it seemed like they had their own like templates,
Mm-hmm.
like already curated content, and then you can see how they did some of the transitions, some of the layering. And for me, I wouldn't use those templates necessarily, but it was good to be like, oh, they created this aesthetic this way.
Right.
Uh, which, yeah, versus, like for me, like my first time going in, I really appreciated that. Um, so cool. Tim, so we're getting to the point in the show of, really talking about what's underneath the hat. And so it's always that big question at the end of, you know, what is under the hat for you? What is top of mind in education? We may have already talked about it, right? So feel free to lean into that, or maybe something that, is keeping you up at night, or maybe you think something we need to be talking more about in education. So Tim, what is under the hat for you?
So there's a lot that I've been considering and thinking about, but one thing that I keep coming back to, I mentioned how I love talking to students about media literacy. I've a website that I use a lot for resources and things like that is the News Literacy Project, and they do a lot of resources for things like, as I said, bias and misinformation and things like that. And we you and I talked about this a little bit before we started recording, but obviously the big thing in education right now is everything with AI. And I'm definitely not an expert in AI. I hesitate to say that there are really any experts in AI at this point, just because if someone does get all the information about it by the next week, all the information is slightly out of date. But I have really been digging into the idea of this sort of media literacy from the lens of artificial intelligence. I did a session at NJECC on sort of the talking to students about using artificial intelligence tools like generative AI ethically and with integrity.
Mm.
And really the reason why I chose to do that session was because I knew by submitting the proposal to do it, I had already started doing research, but I knew I would have to really dig in and share what I found with everybody. So I ended up, through the process of preparing for that session, I ended up learning a lot about some of the things like bias built into AI, the possibility of misinformation, whether from the information generated through large language models or things like AI images being misrepresented if they're posted online. And then also issues of privacy with using platforms, people using AI powered platforms and not being sure where their information is going. And again, I don't think I'm an expert on this, but I do think it's important to talk to students about it so that they're aware of the issues. Because I know that for everybody, not just for students, there can be an instinct when we find some tool online that seems really interesting or really helpful, just sort of jumping in and using it, hitting that single sign on button and just saying, I accept the privacy policy and the terms, and you just start entering information into it. And that's something where it's worth taking a minute and talking to students about it. And even if it's in the context of, here's an AI tool that could be helpful, but before you use it, think about where the information is going, what types of issues could arise from using this tool. And that's something that in my English class specifically, I've been really taking the time when we talk about writing, because I know that students are aware of some of these tools, but I'm not even saying, hey, don't use this because it's cheating. This is this tool, but what are some of the issues that could arise if you do start to use it? So I think that uh, and it's something that I always remind myself to do, is to sometimes pump the brakes and be like, what is the purpose of this? What are the terms that I'm agreeing to when I'm using it? And again, it's the idea of having those conversations with students. I think that's pretty important.
That's a really good point. Like I guess like a lot of times with AI, our teacher brains go like, "Oh, the cheating, the cheating," but it sounds like you're approaching the conversation with students, meeting them more on like a personal level, if I can use that term, because it's more
Mhm.
like, okay, cool, like you can go use that to cheat, but what are you, what are you sacrificing? What are you giving up in return? And if they're okay with that, that's one thing. But to have that conversation with them, because you might be the only one that's having that conversation with them.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's not just saying you can't use this. It's saying I don't want you to use this. Why do you think I don't want you to use this? And you talk about, like you said, what's being lost from using tools in a certain way. And again, it's worth mentioning that the this is new because it's using generative AI, but these are conversations worth having with students before there was this explosion of generative AI. With just a couple of years ago in my English class, one of the assignments I did was I had students, they had to read part of the Snapchat privacy policy in class. That was like a reading assignment, and to sort of like reading comprehension, but also what are you giving this app access to? And some of them had no idea that the app was able to access their data and things like that. So I just find that kind of thing really important, especially as all these websites and platforms keep getting more common.
Yeah. No, I never thought to do that. Like, let's read the terms.
Yeah,
Because how many adults read that thing? Like
right.
nobody does.
And I will mention I didn't have them read all of it because they're designed to be so long that you skip it, and that would take really, really long. But I
Right.
read it and I chose certain parts to zero in on.
Sure. Sure. Sophie brings up a good point, interesting question of like, um, but are they old enough to be okay with that? Do they know enough? Like, and on is their critical thinking developed enough uh, with this subject matter, right? With the conversations that could be had around this.
That is a good point, because I alluding to that assignment I did with the Snapchat privacy policy, we read it, and then afterwards some students, their response was, "Oh yeah, I don't care. They have all my stuff. It's whatever." And for some of them, they don't know that it's right or wrong, but um yeah, it's tough, and it may not resonate with every student, but I think that it's probably still worth having that conversation. Um, but yeah, that is a great point. It doesn't, for some students, maybe the outcome that I have in mind, that's not the conclusion that they come to either.
Oh well, or like what I used to hear was with stuff around this kind of similar to this. But I would have students that'd be like, "Oh, I have nothing to hide. Who
Right.
cares? I'll log into everything. I have nothing to hide." I'm like, "Well, you will someday."
Hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Like you like whether it's a bank account, credit cards, you know, your your identity hits different, I feel, when
Yeah.
you're in adulthood than
Yeah.
when you're a student. So there's all that.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're coming to the end of the show, but this could open up a whole existential can of worms. Like, Google's giving us targeted ads. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Some would say that's actually helpful. Like, I'd rather see ads that interest me. So it's yeah, I'm not going to go down that road, but
Is Facebook listening to me?
yeah. Yeah. Who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, well, Tim, that just means you have to be back on the show.
I'm down, man.
Sequel. Yeah. So Tim, really appreciate you. I appreciate everybody, whether it's on Instagram or in the chat here. Alexa is, oh my gosh, this is actually true. Actually heard Sophie talk with Alexa. And so yeah, so I just, again, I really appreciate everyone jumping in. Tim, I know this is quite late for you. I really appreciate your time. And I just want to say a big thank you to everyone that's continuing to support and dropping in those likes, those, subscribing, all that good stuff. Well, more content, underhatpod.com. And I will also do, because we have to share the love here, Tim has a website too. So timbelmont.com. I clicked on it earlier. There's some cool stuff in there, and that's some, feel free to jump over there and see what Tim is up to, besides making bread. So again, appreciate all of you. And as always, friends, keep your hats on, keep your minds open. Until next time, bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.